Hi guys. So we're going to talk about social psychology, and in this first lecture, we're going to talk about how we think about other people and a little bit of how we influence other people. And so we're going to actually fix a typo. Um, and so we're going to start by looking at these slides together and talking a little bit about that, right? And so social psychology is a study of how people think about, influence, and relate to one another. And we're going to focus on those first two in this first lecture. I think the basic premise that I want you to start with is that we are social creatures, that human beings are not the fastest, we're not the biggest, we're not the strongest, but that we survive because of our social relationships, that early people survived because we worked in groups, and that we continue to be very focused on the people around us, that newborn babies, and I think I may have said this when we were talking about human development, human babies come into the world more focused on human faces and human voices than anything else in their environment. And so we come with a brain that is looking for those relationships, and we continue throughout our lives to be very focused on the people around us. And one way of thinking about this is, you know, and I know that if we think we are all alone, we behave differently than when we know we have people around us, and that we observe the other people around us very closely. We have a hard time not gossiping about other people. We have a hard time not watching strangers and thinking about strangers, even if we never expect to see them again. We watch television shows that either tell us fictional stories about other people. So if you think about soap operas, if you think about TV dramas or even comedies, sitcoms that we watch, and reality television, as much as we might make fun of it. The reason some of you know a whole bunch about the Kardashians is because your very social brain wants to track and understand other people and is fascinated by other people. So we're always thinking about other people. And much of how we think about other people is determined by first impressions. And you probably have heard in other ways in your everyday life how important first impressions are. But first impressions are made really quickly and based on very little information that we can gather very quickly. And so one of the things we will talk about a lot in terms of our social judgment is the fact that our evolution has favored quick decisions over correct decisions. We'd like to make quick and correct decisions. But if we have to make a choice, we're going to choose quick over correct. We're going to err on the side of quick rather than erring on a long decision, a decision that takes a long time to make but may not be correct. And first impressions really follow this rule. And so we often decide very quickly when we meet somebody based on things we can assess quickly. And that mostly is going to be physical appearance and what that person might say in the first moments. And once these impressions are formed, they really are hard to change. That we have something in place called confirmation bias. And confirmation bias means that we are always looking for information that supports the idea that we were right and ignoring information that tells us we were wrong. And that's not just about first impressions. That is overall, that if we've made a decision, we look for all the information that we can that our decision was right, and we ignore information that tells us our decision was wrong. And we do that unconsciously. Like, that is not a conscious process. That is an unconscious, out of awareness process. It's not like we decide to do that. We automatically do it. And so first impressions, once we decide that we don't like somebody, then we need lots and lots of experience with them that proves we're wrong before we change our mind about that. And part of this has to do with something that social psychologists call the fundamental attribution error. All of us have this tendency, so this is something we all do. And what it means is that when we observe the behavior of other people, we assume that what we are seeing reflects their personality, their stable personality traits, who they are, as opposed to assuming that what we're seeing is based in the situation they're in. So when somebody is rude to you in a store, you assume they're a jerk, right? And right, so they're not wearing a mask in a store right now, and they're a jerk. And so you make an assumption about who they are. Somebody cuts you off on the highway, they're a jerk, right? There's a stable personality assessment. We don't say, oh, not usually anyway, we don't say, I bet that person was in a rush and that's why they cut me off on the highway. Um, and so that fundamental attribution error is just our willingness or our tendency to ignore the situation or ignore the potential situations that might dictate behavior. But we only do that for other people. When it comes to our own behavior, we tend to focus on the situation that shapes our behavior, especially negative behavior. So students come to me, right, even in a regular semester, come to me and say, I'm sorry I've been so late with my work, but, and then they tell me about the situation that's making them late with their work. It is less common for a student to come to me and say, um, I'm sorry I'm late with my work, but I'm somebody who can't really ever hand things in on time. That is a less typical explanation. And yet, if professors are late at getting work back, students are more likely to say that professor never gets work back on time. They probably don't care, or they probably are disorganized, or they're probably whatever. But it's about who the professor is, and not, I bet they're having a hard semester. So that's a really important piece to understand about how we think about the people around us. Um, but we also think about ourselves, and the idea of cognitive dissonance is an important point here. Cognitive dissonance occurs when our beliefs or our past behavior contradict or are out of sync with our current behavior. We don't like feelings of cognitive dissonance. We don't like to have mismatches. And so when we have that experience, when we've said something in the past or we've behaved in a certain way in the past, and now we find ourselves behaving differently, we often adjust either our memory of the past behavior so that we could have an experience more of consistency, or we adjust our beliefs. We say that, that either I never acted like that, or we change our values. We change the thing that is at odds with our behavior. And the example I always use here is about my brother, who I love dearly. He's one of the best human beings I know. But years ago, when our cousins started getting engaged, Rob insisted that engagements were stupid. Expensive engagement rings were stupid, and having to give engagement gifts was stupid. And then Rob got engaged and bought a big ring and had an engagement party. And when I went to my husband and said, what should we get Rob and Sue for their engagement? Jim said, oh, no, your brother has to have the courage of his convictions, right? And I remember saying to Rob, I thought that you thought this was stupid. And he looked at me and said, I never said that. And that moment when he says, I never said that, is what we all do to bring down that state of dissonance. Rather than saying, well, I said that, but now I'm doing something else, and I know that that feels hypocritical, right? That's not what we do so often. We change our past memory to match what we're currently doing. All right. So I want to talk about social influence. So that was how we think about ourselves and other people. But we're going to spend a bit of time talking about how we influence other people and how other people are influenced with us. And I want you to think about this question. Would you harm someone else if you were ordered to? And that is, we often have a quick answer to that question. Most of us probably would say no, I wouldn't follow orders to harm somebody. And this became a really interesting question post-World War II, because post-World War II, the world looked at Germany and what the Nazis and German collaborators had done in Germany to harm other people. And a lot of people defended themselves, a lot of Germans defended themselves, even German citizens who had turned in Jewish neighbors, defended themselves by saying, I was just following orders. And it raised the question of whether there was something about Germans that made them follow orders to harm other people, or if in fact all of us would follow orders to harm other people if we were ordered to, or whether lots of us would. And so there's a researcher, Stanley Milgram, who became really interested in this question and does this very famous experiment on obedience, and whether in fact we all have a tendency to obey authority figures regardless of what they tell us to do. And the short answer to this, right, is that we all do obey authority figures to some extent. I tell you to hand a paper in, and you feel obligated to hand the paper in. I tell you when we're, when we're in on-ground classes, I tell you that you have to get into groups, and you get into groups, right? And that because I have been given authority in that arena. But the question is whether we would actually violate our values to obey commands. And so he was really interested in this. He worked at Yale. He was a researcher at Yale. And he found in his research that 2/3 of the New Haven residents that were his research subjects obeyed orders to harm another person, even when they believed that they might be killing that other person. And so what I would like you to do is, as this video ends, is to watch the Milgram video that is up in the course materials, and then we'll reconvene and continue talking about how we influence other people when we start the next video. Okay, so you do that and we'll talk some more.